Hello, my name is Fernando. There's nothing as powerful as Tacitus. You never know where it will lead you one day. Unfortunately, my father and I had to go through this to realize this truth. For as long as I can remember, I've always considered my father as an indifferent and insensitive person. And it's not surprising. He spent his entire life working as a policeman, so he saw some crazy things in his life. My mother died when I was only 2 years old, so the only person who gave me love and care was my paternal grandmother. It was almost impossible to have a sincere relationship with my father, especially when it came to my mother. He would always get angry and refuse to talk about her. I love looking at old photos of my mother in family albums and trying to imagine what she looked like. She had the most expressive eyes I had ever seen and a little smudge on her lips. My grandmother always said that my mother loved me and that she had been a very good person, and I bet I would never have learned more if I hadn't argued with my father about my grades at school that morning. I decided to walk in the park so I wouldn't go home. So I was walking down the road when I saw a scantily dressed woman walking toward me. She passed me very quickly, but I could see her face, eyes, and that stain on her lips. I knew it was impossible and probably all a big coincidence, but my legs carried me and made me follow her. She left the park and entered an unknown street a few blocks away. She stopped near a supermarket, spread a blanket on the ground, and then sat down. I kept my distance while trying to get a better look at her. I couldn't believe it. I don't know how long I stood there, but it was dark when I returned home. I immediately entered the living room and picked up an old photo album. There were amazing pictures from my mother and father's wedding day. As I turned the pages, I saw a photo of my mother taken not long before her death. I could have sworn it was that beggar woman in that photo. That beggar woman looked a lot like the pictures of my mother, only much older and wrinkled. I took it out of the album and put it in my pocket. The next day after school, I went straight to that supermarket. I had to wait a few hours until that woman finally appeared and sat on a blanket. I plucked up the courage and went over to her. She gave me an indifferent look and asked, "Would you like something?" I mumbled, still uneasy, and said no, but I stayed where I was. She got upset and asked me what the hell I wanted. So I took my mother's photo and handed it to her. I saw the woman shudder as she looked at it but didn't say a word. The woman remained silent and handed me back the picture. I held my breath and said, "I am Fernando." She looked up and down at me with interest and a bitter smile. After an awkward pause, we began an informal conversation, and I told her I had always been told that she had died. I asked her to tell me the whole story, but she refused to talk about it. She also made me promise not to tell my father about our reunion. On the way home, I was overcome with both happiness and rage. My father had lied to me my whole life and probably made my grandmother keep her mouth shut, but I kept my promise. When I opened the front door, I greeted my father, gritted my teeth, and went straight to my room. From then on, I would see my mother every day after school. We talked about everything, but she always avoided answering when I tried to find out what had happened many years ago. Still, the more time we spent together, the more determined I was to get my mother out of that situation no matter what. Winter was approaching, so I brought her warm clothes and food and gave her all my pocket money. She never asked me for anything, but was always grateful for these little things. I felt I had to do more. So I started inventing ways to get more money from my father and grandmother. That still wasn't enough, so I started stealing. I had no shame because I was sure I was doing it for a good cause and was quite successful. Until one day, my father finally caught me. He was furious and started yelling and saying the most hurtful things. So I collapsed and told him everything. I called him a filthy liar and threatened to leave home to live with my mother on the streets. He was shocked, didn't say a word, and silently went to his room. The next day when I went to see my mother, I recognized my father talking to her. He didn't look friendly and wouldn't even let my mother speak. When he left, I saw her crying. I went toward her, but when she saw me coming, she got up and ran away. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't catch her. I was filled with rage and hatred. So I caught up with my father in the street and attacked him. I was screaming so loud that people were looking at us and pointing fingers. My father was standing there stone-faced. He waited until I was finished and said, "She's not who you think she is. She's the one who killed your mother and left." I stood in the middle of the street in shock. I had nowhere to go but to my grandmother's. When I told her the whole story, she started crying. I begged her to tell me the truth. Finally, she surrendered. She went to her room and came back with a picture. When I looked at it, I almost fell off my chair. Two girls were smiling in the image. They both had the most expressive eyes and little spots under their lips. I couldn't believe my eyes. My grandmother pointed to one of them and said, "This is Jennifer, that's her mother, and that's Grace, her older sister." As it turned out, my mother and her sister Grace were very different. My mother had prospered in life. She was a good student and had a successful career. She soon met a nice boy, married him, and had a beautiful baby girl. She had me. In contrast, Grace went down a very dark path. She quit school when she was 15 and spent most of her time drinking and partying with her friends. Despite all that, my mother and her sister remained close friends. She was the only person who tried to support and help Grace. My mother loved her sister with all her heart, but Grace wouldn't listen and continued to live that way until she suddenly started to feel very bad. She lost weight and couldn't get out of bed. She was diagnosed with an advanced stage of cirrhosis. My mother took her to the best doctors in the country, but the only way to save Grace's life was with a liver transplant. No matter how hard her sister tried to talk her out of it, my mother donated her liver to save her sister. Grace survived and began to feel much better. However, my mother began to have serious health problems. Yet, this did not stop Grace from living the same lifestyle she used to have. She finally ended up on the streets, and my mother died for nothing. Her death was a hard blow to my father. Grandma said that he had completely changed. He threw himself into his work and became hard and ruthless. Even a lovely child like me couldn't melt his heart. This story broke my heart. I was looking at the picture of my mother and Grace with tears on my face. The reality was nothing like I expected, and I didn't know what to do with it. I went home and found my father sitting alone in his study. He saw the picture in my hand and realized I had already learned the truth. He said he was sorry he didn't tell me sooner. He thought he would keep me safe by not telling me about the past, but in reality, he broke my heart. He told me that he was helping Grace even after my mother's passing, but she was a lost cause. Well, whatever it is, life goes on. Grace continued living on the street. I occasionally went to the supermarket to see if she was there, but I never saw her again. My father said that she hadn't contacted him either. Thankfully, we're getting along much better now. This horrible story has brought us closer together. We both realized how important it is to listen to each other and discuss things to avoid these awful misunderstandings.